This is your classroom. This is your world. But how does what you're learning here relate to what's happening out there? And how might these issues affect you today and tomorrow? Time to find out. I'm your host, Simon Jackson, and class starts right now. Okay, so Canada is at a crossroads. On this, we agree. But when you stop and think about it, what else can we agree on? If we're being honest, the answer is not much.
You kind of have to ask the question, were we ever united?
All in this together, elbows up, let's get real. When the puck's in deep, far too often we stop playing as a team. And while we might appear to be on the same page in the wake of US President Donald Trump's threats, in reality, unity is only about a centimeter deep.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it's not very deep. It's covering over some long-standing feelings.
And those long-standing disagreements in Canada? Businessman and former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Aaron O'Toole, says
the pandemic exacerbated existing tensions in our country.
And pollster Sashi Curl agrees.
I think the thing that has changed in the last several years, call it polarizing or call it just sort of the surfacing of a lot of discordant views, so a lot of opposing views, whereas people in the past might not have been as comfortable sort of saying, I don't really agree because we're Canadian and we like to be nice.
What happened during the pandemic? Aaron O'Toole tells us.
We saw a lot of breakdown of social cohesion because of the isolation, because of the fear of the pandemic, and some politicians took advantage of that.
Though we tried being all in it together, we ended up more divided than ever. As scientist Dr. Kate Moran argues, some of us vilified the medical profession when they didn't give us information that aligned with our worldview.
It became even worse during COVID, and that kind of misinformation has spread.
And as Aaron O'Toole adds, some of us also vilified anti-vaxxers, deepening distrust in science and democratic institutions.
It just hardened positions rather than educating and enlightening and listening. I do think we're going to continue to pay for that decision in the years to come.
And that, according to Aaron, is the bigger issue. The pandemic allowed echo chambers and misinformation to take root on all sides, deepening those existing divisions in our country.
That's what's caused the polarization, both east and west, rural versus urban, the climate apocalypse left and the drill baby drill right. Far more than the pandemic and the isolation from that, it was the over-reliance on social media and the destructive elements of it. The divides Aaron listed are getting worse, not better, in part because each of us increasingly subscribe to our own truth. Why is this a problem? Lawyer and democracy advocate Peter Bureau explains.
When many people believe, as they do today, that each person is entitled to their own facts, then there can't be any universal commitment to truth and to reality, where universality, where the very idea of any kind of absolute truth on any important question is ridiculed, is disbelieved, is demeaned.
East versus west, north versus south, urban versus rural, pro-environment versus pro-economy. When each segment of our population becomes closed off within their own echo chamber, believing only in their own truth, it becomes very hard for a country like Canada to move forward, as Peter argues.
There can be no shared understanding of facts, of knowledge, and of truth, however provisional. There can be no consensus generation, no ability to make decisions together based on a common understanding of the important realities, the relevant realities in the world.
This is a problem at the best of times, and it's especially a problem when Canada is facing multiple crises. To get through this hard stretch as a country, to protect our economy and our sovereignty while still finding room to address other critical issues that haven't just gone away, we must do a better job of understanding why those we disagree with hold a different view than our own. Where to start? How about right here?
We are now kind of at the thorny, crash-prone intersection of, well, what are we going to do? And that's causing a lot of people to pull apart, because even if we lived in a world where there were no action required at the end of agreeing with something, okay, yes, let's all agree climate is changing and that's bad. What are we going to do about it? That's where the difficulty comes in.
You see, in many ways, this is the metaphorical, thorny, crash-prone intersection pollster Sashi Curl is referring to. After all, in Canada, so often what divides us isn't geography or language, but rather our perception of which road we should take here, the intersection of the environment and the economy. Why is this at the heart of our national divisions? Well, economics expert Heather Schofield asks.
It's worth thinking in Canada, what do we have that we can show to ourselves and perhaps the rest of the world if they're interested, that allows for everybody to be more prosperous and for us all to have at least a bit of extra space in our heads to pay attention to the broader social good?
The answer is pretty obvious, isn't it? Canada's natural advantage, of course, is our natural resources.
Natural resources are obviously something that Canada's always had a lot of. Do we just continue along the path that we've been going through since time immemorial in terms of producing these things, or do we figure out how to do more of it in an environmentally compatible way and in a way that makes some of that processing of those natural resources based right here in Canada so that we're a little bit more resilient and a little bit more autonomous, I would say, in how we develop all those things? I think that's certainly one area that we have a lot of potential.
That, of course, is the question, and it's one worth pondering at this intersection, in the heart of your classroom, Mount Robson Provincial Park. You see, this is Highway 16. If you don't already consider it to be so, undoubtedly soon it will be Canada's official national energy or major project corridor. Pipeline? Check. Fiber optic line? Check. Railway? Check. Highway? Check. And soon we might have a lot bigger and better versions of each through this, the Highway 16 corridor. You see, the thinking goes like this. We're not self-reliant, and that blame goes back generations. For too long, we've taken the easy way out. Because, well, it was easy. We haven't created reliable transportation corridors across our country to allow for easier travel. We haven't built infrastructure to develop and share our resources within our borders. We haven't created nearly enough capacity to trade with nations beyond America. And fixing this, well, it takes time and money. But for aforementioned reasons, people might not want to invest in Canada right now. And that's why economist Trevor Tome opined that Canada should put all of our effort into improving our economy. How? By creating a better investment climate, something Trevor and many economists think is possible if we 1. Reform our tax code, 2. Reduce regulatory red tape and remove internal roadblocks, and 3. Stop political opposition to big projects and build better infrastructure. So why choose this road? Well, as Heather Schofield explains.
Certain areas of our economy that are fantastic and that the world wants more of, and that if we focus on maybe a handful of really excellent things as a country and make them shine and make them brilliant, I think that can go a long way to pulling up the whole country.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. What about the environment? Conservative strategist Hamish Marshall argues.
If you're building a pipeline, if it's designed and engineered properly, it has almost no impact on the environment and could be reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Asia if you're exporting Canadian natural gas.
And while for the most part Mount Robson Park won't be further developed if we choose this road, many landscapes in this country will be opened for development. And their bounty moved to markets right here with an expanded Highway 16 infrastructure corridor through your classroom. In choosing this road,
it's not something that we can have happen quickly because we've taken so long. And, even if you made a decision on a pipeline today, it's not going to get built for years. So we have to make a long-term strategic decision to try to diversify who we trade with. The Trump threats and the tariffs that we've seen for the last little while, force Canada to look at our place in the world, look for other opportunities.
And what other opportunities might exist at this intersection for Canada? Well, there's this road, one that takes us into the heart of Mount Robson Provincial Park. And this park, it's more than a famous view of a 3,954-meter hunk of rock, the tallest peak in the Canadian Rockies. This park is also home to 4 ecoregions, including a rainforest that sustain the ecosystem's 182 bird species, its 42 mammals, the 4 resident amphibians, and 1 species of snake. Mount Robson is but one of hundreds of similar parks across Canada that act as a reservoir of biodiversity, and it could be one of thousands if we choose this road, along with places like Russia and Brazil, neither of whom are exactly world leaders in advancing global good at the moment. We're one of a handful of nations, because of our small population and large geographic size, that can actually save biodiversity. As the former United Nations biodiversity lead, Dr. David Cooper, tells us.
Look at Canada. We have this vast boreal forest. We need actually to maintain practically all of that boreal forest and maintain it as boreal forest, whether or not it's a formal protected area, if we're going to maintain the life support systems of the planet.
And as political scientist turned Liberal MP Dr. Will Greaves adds,
we need to really recognize the extent to which Canada And Canadians have an obligation to safeguard in a much more diligent way the biodiversity and the natural heritage that we have in this country, not just for ourselves, although definitely that as well, but in fact, because it plays a vital role in global stewardship. That Canada has such a vital wealth of natural ecology, and in particular, the role of the boreal forest, to name one example, that are of global significance, that we really have an obligation to safeguard that on behalf of people all over the world. That this is a global responsibility that is borne by Canada.
That's the environmental case. But what about the economic case? Angel investor Randall Howard asks,
what kind of investments do we need to make in our economy, recognizing that pipelines for oil and gas are for fossil fuels, which are fueling the climate crisis and obviously on their way out? So there's a time frame for that we need to remember. Given that's the case, Canada has a very important countrywide choice to make, and that is, how long do we have to decarbonize our economy, to wean ourselves from oil and gas? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? It's probably more in that range. So that's a lot of jobs to move in that time. Canada has had a choice. We can change that job makeup around our fossil fuel jobs, create new companies that are going to dominate the world, and we can be healthy and we can be wealthy and economically vibrant and maintain a good quality of life. And there's the alternative. So I think that we are standing at a crossroads, as you say.
And scientist Dr. Kate Moran goes further.
You know how hard it is to build a pipeline across the mountains? It is really expensive. So it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any economic sense. We need to turn the page. Canada has the ability to provide renewable energy as an export. We know that DC cables can transmit electricity far, very far. So building our renewable power to produce goods, take our natural resources to produce goods, and export them sustainably. Advocating for more oil exports is short-sighted and not sustainable.
So there you have it. Two choices, one intersection. Which is the better road forward? As you know, Sam Sullivan is a seasoned politician, and he says,
the best answer I've ever heard is, it depends.
Sam, the former mayor of Vancouver and a former BC cabinet minister, has spent his life juggling chicken or the egg questions just like this one.
I think everybody wants to have a healthy environment, but there's different opinions as to how we weight each of those goals.
Indeed. And we need to really listen to the diverse opinions of our neighbors if we're to make the right choice at the crossroads we're facing as a nation.
Specifically for Indigenous communities, it was from the earth that communities were able to thrive. That is the same for non-Indigenous communities as well. So we need to be thinking critically about how we want to interact with the earth, what values are important to us, what do we need to protect, where do we need to give, and what kind of a world are we comfortable leaving for the next generation? Because those are not just Indigenous conversations, but conversations that everybody needs to be having right now.
What we have to do is find a balance. And I think both the environmental movement and sort of the energy industry and the hardcore advocates will have to recognize that both sides have valid concerns.
Exactly. So let's check our biases and really understand the two roads that meet at this intersection. Obviously, Canada is rich in natural resources. We all understand, at least at a basic level, that developing our natural resources equates to jobs and, in some cases, the very existence of a community. But how well do we actually understand the industry?
Even here in Alberta, people don't really understand the benefit of the resource industry.
Hal Kvisle is the former CEO of TransCanada Pipelines and is considered one of the energy industry's leading voices.
If you think about where Alberta is today and compare that to the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, both of which were quite a bit bigger in population terms than Alberta 85 years ago, you could see that the reason this place has thrived and prospered is the development of energy resources.
Hal says that impact has allowed Alberta to create the second largest pool of skilled workers on the planet. And he believes that means
we're so much better equipped today than we were 50 years ago to actually generate significant economic value without being harmful to the environment.
But a successful resource industry is about more than innovation.
The royalties that the oil companies pay go into provincial coffers and pay for schools and hospitals and things like that.
It's true, the resource extraction industry does pay for a fair number of hospitals and schools and roads, but they pay for a lot more than that. Why? Because the resource industry in Canada pays governments, on average, $15 billion per year in tax and royalties. And while that number is down from the $20 billion that they paid in years gone by, it's still a very big number. But not as big as this number. $500 billion. That's how much money the resource industry contributes to Canada's total exports. And if you haven't already heard, that's pretty important to a trading nation like Canada. You see, raw resource exports don't require us to import additional materials to make a final product for export. That means our resource exports have incredible value. It's a major reason why the resource industry accounts for almost 1/5 of Canada's gross domestic product, the most commonly used metric to determine the health of our economy. And a healthy economy, it's about more than balance sheets, helping determine things like credit scores, which really helps when a country needs to borrow money in a time of crisis like the one we're facing right now.
But that's only the tip of the iceberg.
Hal Kavissy is right. 21 million Canadians are employed in a given year, and almost 2 million of those jobs, directly or indirectly, stem from the resource industry.
The real benefit is in the high quality employment that these companies offer to their employees, the very interesting work that people do.
That's nice, but so too is this.
The very significant income taxes that those individuals pay.
Why is that important? Heather Schofield explains.
How do we pay as a society for the hospitals and the schools and the arenas and the everyday amenities that we all share? We pay for it through taxes, and we only pay taxes if we've got work to do.
In other words, for all of the value the resource industry provides our country in terms of taxes paid and GDP value created and donations to social causes offered, it all pales in comparison to the tax revenue our governments generate from workers in the resource industry. As Hal says,
that's a much bigger fish.
It is, because a robust tax base, that helps to sustain our environment. After all, the largest funder of conservation in Canada, you guessed it, the government. Now it's true biodiversity is in decline in Canada, and it's also true that because of our boreal forest, Canada can be a global leader in halting biodiversity loss. And yes, many of our resource development opportunities can be found in that same boreal forest. But resource development, in the traditional sense, isn't the largest driver of biodiversity loss in Canada. That distinction goes to agriculture, though housing in cities and rural communities shouldn't get off that easy either. And though the real estate and agricultural industries help pay for parks and restoration and endangered species protection through tax, and that paid by its employees, they don't pay as much the tab as the resource industry, which means the resource industry isn't just important to our economy, but to our conservation efforts as well. And then there's this.
The reality is that a certain amount of climate change has already happened. And there's another reality too, which is that the world still demands a lot of fossil fuels, and we have them. If we can get to that far in the conversation, there's a very productive talk to have about, yes, if we're going to produce fossil fuels, what are we going to do to make sure that they actually create as few emissions as possible?
Economics expert Heather Schofield is right, and she says this could be a huge opportunity for Canada.
It's a pretty exciting area for Canada because we are confronted with this problem all the time. It actually spurs on a lot of research, and the biggest solution on the table is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Can we deploy it at scale? How are we going to pay for it? How soon can we get it up and running? That's a very interesting, productive conversation.
And while some demand nothing short of this,
we really need to start thinking about how we can help create and support new economies for people who are working in resource extractive industries that are really doing injustices. And so this isn't to say that I'm anti-jobs, right? I'm really advocating for a just transition.
Former federal Conservative Cabinet Minister Monty Sahlberg argues,
I do think there is a pathway open to ensuring that we can produce energy and at the same time reduce emissions. And I would say something approaching a consensus around, for instance, export liquefied natural gas. While it can be argued it contributes to overall climate change, it can also be argued that it really reduces carbon emissions by supplanting energy sources like coal in India and other places in Asia that still rely heavily on coal. So I'd rather make progress as we go than throw a lot of money at different solutions and find out they don't work and continue yelling at each other and find out that we're getting nowhere.
And if the goal is to go somewhere new, we will need money to invest in emerging industries, adds angel investor and tech entrepreneur Randall Howard.
Canada needs to have more capital for these early stage businesses that will allow us to transform our economy.
That capital investment, Former Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole suggests that it could come from resource revenue, so long as we don't abandon the industry.
As we have for the next decade and a half, oil and gas still being consumed in huge quantities around the world, can we take some of the revenues from that and build out the electrification economy? Take coal out of all of the Canadian electricity grid, like Ontario did with nuclear. That still ranks as the biggest emission reduction success story in Canadian history. But that takes money to build new generation.
Money the resource industry can provide. And as Heather Schofield adds,
strengthening Canada's competitive advantage and building up our economy, it's not just a pipeline. There are many, many, many other areas that we have potential in. And, some of them are around natural resources. It's around critical minerals and trying to build the clean technology of the future.
Right, critical minerals. Because even if developing them might hurt some aspects of the environment, not developing them might hurt us even more.
When we talk resources, critical minerals, uranium are also about electrifying, building EVs. These projects will help decarbonize the electricity grid by getting more emission-free energy on. We should work with the United States on this. We should decarbonize the North American grid together. More hydroelectricity from Quebec, from Ontario, from Manitoba, from British Columbia, and more nuclear. Uranium from Saskatchewan.
And it's why Aaron O'Toole wants you to realize
we're going to have an energy transition that is smart. So a smart energy transition is a timeline. And on that timeline, you have to use the benefit we have from our abundance of traditional forms of energy and build up capacity to decarbonize in a way that's fair and build up from the revenues, charging stations and new small modular reactors so that on that timeline, we can phase out higher emission sources. We can work on biodiversity.
So that's why the resource industry matters to our economy and why it also matters to the environment. So choosing this road is a no-brainer, right? Well, not so fast, says scientist Dr. Kate Moran. She believes that the urgency of the environmental issues we face demands that we take this road instead. But this road, it looks slow, and we need to move fast. If we were to choose this road going forward, can it actually deliver fast results?
World War II is my answer. We can move fast. Do you know how many factories were built in the U.S. when they declared war in World War II? It was months.
Do we need to move faster? Do we need to take a different road? Scientist Dr. Brian Menounos tells us
there's a clear connection between rising air temperatures and rising greenhouse gas emissions. There's not much dispute there. Should Canadians be alarmed? They should be concerned. They should be concerned about changes in natural resources. The reality is that projected climate change will impact many of these systems, but will also affect many areas of infrastructure and economic growth simply because of the consequences of damage caused by intense precipitation events, for example. Those are factors that have to be taken into account.
In other words, given the importance of natural resources to our economy, and given the potential impact of environmental problems on natural resources, we should consider prioritizing the environment for the sake of our economy. Liberal MP Dr. Will Greaves adds,
once you go through with a project, be it a mine, be it a new pipeline project, that project goes through and then it exists. And then all of the consequences and the potential negative impacts have to be dealt with indefinitely. Whereas when an environmental movement or party wins a public policy victory, it's temporary because it can always be revisited. It can always be reversed down the road.
Interestingly, it's a view shared by business leader Jimmy Pattison.
We know more about the world and the earth and the atmosphere and all of it, and more population in the world. It's important that we pay a lot of attention to the environment.
Jimmy is one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs.
I don't think that's correct, but we're working on it.
How? In part forestry and fishing, industries that impact the environment for sure, but also industries impacted by the environment. That's why Jimmy tells us to grow our economy, we need to prioritize nature. Why?
It's the right thing to do.
For nature, but also,
I think it's good business.
It's why Jimmy believes this debate is simple.
This is Mother Nature here, is that we've given us a wonderful asset and we have to look after it.
And the key word there is asset. Nature gives us life, of course, but it also gives us many of our livelihoods. After all, the resource industry is nothing without nature. In fact, very few industries can withstand ecological loss. How so? Well, again, consider your classroom and the river that runs through it, the mighty Fraser.
The Fraser, like all major river systems across this country, is massively important. It's a food-producing resource, an economic engine, and a vital transportation route for cultures since time immemorial. Today, in addition to the river being home to 2/3 of Canada's third most populous province, it's also responsible for 80% of the GDP of one of Canada's richest regions. It's why river systems are amongst the most important pieces of infrastructure in our society. Highways and railways and buildings are nice, but not many of those infrastructure investments yield trillions of dollars in value. Don't believe me? Well, for starters, the Fraser and the other 24 major river systems in Canada supply 1/5 of the world's clean water supply. That's priceless, of course, but in actual dollar terms, the Fraser River alone provides $190 billion in economic value, equivalent to 80% of BC's GDP and 10% of Canada's. Canada's largest river system, the Deschaux or Mackenzie, is valued at almost $450 billion per year, more than 10 times the economic value of its neighboring industries, the oil sands. And both these river systems, along with so many others, are the lifeblood of communities all along their banks and, of course, all along our vast ocean shoreline. How so? Quinn Scott explains.
If you think about how much money the recreational Chinook fishery alone is a $1 billion a year industry. That's just recreational fisheries, just for Chinook. $1 billion a year industry.
Quinn is a professional fisherman, but he's also worried for his job and what the loss of this industry might mean to cultures, economies, and to nature.
It's not a huge scope that I have. There's people that have been fishing the systems I've been fishing 50 years. I can't even imagine seeing it like that. It's only been 15 for me, and it's brutal. It's dark.
Why is the economic future dark for fisheries? According to Quinn, it's because of other economic choices we've made.
Forestry is one of the absolute biggest causes of our stocks declining.
Forestry along the Fraser, to be exact. But is Quinn picking on one industry, one livelihood to save his own? He says no.
We could drop the axe on commercial fishing. We could say no more. For a full cycle, a 6-year cycle. We can't just immediately shotgun emergency fix the damage that's been done in logging. The way a river looks after its headwaters has been logged, it ruins it. It becomes essentially a chute.
What does that mean?
The root structure under a 100-year-old tree on the side of a river somewhere up in the mountains is holding together the side of the mountain. We start clear cutting all that stuff away. Suddenly, the natural heavy rainfall is no longer natural. It becomes detrimental. It becomes fatal.
Not just for salmon or for those who rely on the fishing industry. If you've been paying close attention to the news in the last few years, you might know how far-reaching the economic consequences of floods truly can be, especially in BC, especially along the Fraser River. And as Quinn argues, all the tree planting and restoration efforts in the world can't address the root of the problem.
The issue with logging and forestry practices throughout history and why it makes such a difference now is you can't plant a 100-year-old tree.
And though 100-year-old trees matter to fish and fishers, they also matter to the logging industry. The massive trees that grow on Canada's west coast and an inland rainforest near Mount Robson are amongst the most profitable type of tree to logging companies. The tree's ability to grow so old and so big? Salmon. And they, thanks to bears that transport them to the forest floor, feed the trees, as decomposing salmon provide the nutrients for the trees to get as big as they are. That means as the salmon go, so too may go many of the profitable forests in the Fraser Basin. And that's an issue, but not the only issue facing the logging industry, as Art Carson explains.
It's a very, very complex issue dealing with a forest.
Art should know. He's a professional forester who worked with the BC Forest Service and doubles as Robson Valley's local historian. Despite criticisms that the forest industry has impacted salmon populations and the economy in the process, Art believes the forest industry has
always been a little bit better, I think, than public sometimes thinks.
But good or bad, Art Carson tells us the forest industry
won't be quite the massive scale that it was.
Because of declining salmon? No. Art fears for the future of the logging industry in the Fraser Basin because of the consequences of the pine beetle infestation. Biologist Laura Kennedy has researched this issue.
I was in northern BC during the peak of that crisis, and the effects of it were visual and widespread and incredible. Once the problem began, I don't know that there was a way to actually control it.
Why? Well, for decades we suppressed naturally reoccurring
clearing fires to help our economy, forestry, and tourism. But fires are actually a good thing. They help regenerate forests and control beetle populations, which exist to regenerate smaller stands of unhealthy trees. When we suppressed the fires, the beetle population exploded. The other failsafe that long kept the beetle population in check, cold winters, also started becoming less frequent. With warmer winters and fewer fires, the pine beetle spread across 18 million hectares, more than the size of 25 million soccer pitches, and over 60% of the Fraser Basin's total forested landscape. The consequence was vast and far-reaching. The logging industry and communities that rely on it were thrown into disarray, with many communities and companies struggling to this day. The dead trees combined with salvage logging put into service to mitigate the new threat of superfires, like the one that devastated the community of Jasper in 2024, mean that peak water flows, say after the spring melt, are now 92% higher than before the pine beetle infestation. The consequence? Floods, and lots of them. Though the pine beetle has peaked in BC, it appears to be marching and blowing with the wind thanks to increasingly challenging weather into the boreal forest proper, increasing the risk of superfires, and as we keep seeing every summer, turning carbon sinks into carbon emitters. Laura Kennedy tells us,
if all of that sort of forest area burns off, you're going to have mudslides and the water retention is going to be different, and that's going to change sort of the entire ecosystem.
In fact, long-serving BC Cabinet Minister Mike Farnworth told us that the pine beetle's economic toll has helped illustrate
better understanding and a greater realization that climate change isn't just about the earth warming. It is about the impacts that that has, so that it allows situations such as the pine beetle to happen, because we don't get those cold winters anymore that would kill the larvae.
For all of these reasons, the United Nations' David Cooper argues that we need to prioritize nature. Otherwise,
that will undermine our socioeconomic goals.
After all, biodiversity is the foundation of life on Earth. A diversity of species is what allows for pollination and food security, water filtration and purification, waste management and pollution mitigation, not to mention carbon storage. We can't afford, in every sense of the word, to live without biodiversity. But as David explains,
we can devote certain areas where we prioritize the conservation of biodiversity, and that is an essential part of the policy mix that is needed. But in doing so, we must make sure that we protect the most important areas for biodiversity. And so we should be careful about having simply an area target and not prioritizing the areas of priority for biodiversity.
What does David mean? Take it away, Liberal MP Dr. Will Greaves.
One of the ironies of Canada and Canadian public life is that the country is so huge and has such vast expanses of wilderness and natural beauty that it has led to a sense, I think, on the part of many Canadians that we have so much nature that we don't need to be as attentive to it, that we don't necessarily need to be as concerned with some local environmental impacts of this project or that project because there's so much nature out there. That myth is one that I think we need to really be rid of.
You see, because Canada is so vast and because we think we have so much nature, sometimes we don't protect the areas that need to be saved. Sometimes we assume that development is fine, in so much as there will always be somewhere else we can protect. And while that calculation might be mostly true, it's not always true. And as biodiversity expert Harvey Locke explains, like the economy, half measures don't always work.
Recent scientific assessment by the IPBES says we're in a crisis and we need transformative change. We really need to protect half the world in an interconnected way. That's really what the numbers are.
The key here is interconnected. Take your classroom as an example.
The entire complex constitutes one of the world's greatest assemblages of protected areas, and the aggregate of those things is the size of the entire country, Switzerland.
This matters.
The Rocky Mountain parks together have a viable population of grizzly bears. The Rocky Mountain parks individually do not.
In other words, because we went all in on the conservation of this area?
So you have this full assemblage of large mammals, including the large carnivores, which are the hardest things to keep.
But remember, saving biodiversity is bigger than just saving grizzly bears in the Rocky Mountains.
The reason we have large mammals left in the world is because of parks, full stop, period. They would not be here if we hadn't made conscious efforts to protect musk oxen, white rhinoceros, and orangutan, and grizzly bears, and bison in parks. We wouldn't have them now. Those are just cold facts.
Saving biodiversity means protecting species big and small, species convenient and inconvenient. Which is why engineer and financial executive Sandra Odendahl argues,
to understand the world around you at a basic level, to understand the changes happening in the world around you, the implications, I think that a basic understanding of that is really important to everyone because, you know, we're a wholly owned subsidiary of planet Earth. You got to understand the spaceship that you're on. Even if you don't know how to work all the controls, you should have a basic understanding of how it works.
And how it works? Ecosystem services, they're worth upwards of $179 trillion American per year to the global economy. That's trillion with a T.
To protect those services, it will cost the world a relatively small $200 billion per year if we act fast. If we don't, and yet want to safeguard the sweet, sweet economic value of those ecosystem services, the price will rise to $900 billion per year.
What does this mean for Canada? Well, remember the grizzly bear?
Money is being put towards grizzly bears because they're fascinating and people want them to be protected and want to study them. When you look at a grizzly bear and you protect the habitat of that one grizzly bear, you're actually protecting the habitat of all the other species that it comes into contact with too. What it eats, what it preys on, what it defends from its territory, the wolves, the ravens, everything that it works in coexistence with.
Biologist Sarah Ramirez is right. In some circumstances, by taking urgent action to enhance protection for a species like the grizzly bear, already relatively well protected, we can actually bring down the overall cost of biodiversity conservation because we get such great bang for our buck and because our chances of success are high. But in the case of the caribou?
All caribou are actually endangered across every subspecies.
Stephanie Leonard and Nikita Lattery have helped champion Caribou Patrol, an indigenous-led stewardship program that works along the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. And as they tell us,
the landscape, the environment is out of balance. Something is out there that is causing an imbalance to the system. And the caribou are the warning sign. There isn't another animal out there that can take caribou's place.
In other words, without fast action, we might lose the caribou. Does it matter? As financial executive Sandra Odendahl says,
do you save the mountain caribou because it's going to cost $1 gazillion and the chances are pretty low? Or do you save 6 other species, use that same $1 gazillion, but the chances are higher? You know, that's not just a scientific question. I don't know if everyone's equipped to have those conversations because they're disassociated from nature.
That's a problem.
This lack of connection, we just don't see how the pieces fit together at all.
Ethicist Dr. Kerry Bowman is right, and as he adds,
there could be cascade effects with biodiversity. We have a very high level of loss, and it's escalating very, very quickly. We don't even know what could be triggered.
Look, with both roads, with both options, there is risk.
How much risk are we, as a nation, willing to accommodate at a moment like this, economically or environmentally? The answer likely depends on where we live, how we might be impacted, and how well we understand the issues. In other words, there won't be one simple answer.
Which is good, which is bad? You know, I don't think I can give a clear-cut answer. Maybe that's my problem with numbers in the end, is that numbers sort of force me to look at things from a more probabilistic perspective, that very rarely is something all good or all bad. There's things that are positive and things that are negative to every decision.
This is why we have demarcation lines all across our society. But the most pronounced, at least on this question, the urban-rural divide.
Of course, the urban-rural divide isn't new. It started in about 1900 when cities started becoming a thing. But it's growing and has never been more pronounced than it is right now, as pollster Sashi Curl explains.
That is now framing and reframing almost every facet and part of Canadian policy and societal debate.
How so? We asked rural advocate Joel McKay.
He told us, quote, what's needed is a society in which every Canadian can succeed. That means access to proper education, healthcare, social services, a job market with robust opportunities. These things can only exist in rural areas if we have a landscape that's attractive to business development. That means we need an environment that supports resource extraction and leverages the benefits generated from that to reinvest in rural areas so that they have just as much opportunity as our urban areas.
In other words, by choosing one road over another at this crossroads, we risk dividing our nation. And when it comes to decisions like this one,
Joel says, quote, unlike other jurisdictions, Canada does not have a proportionate electoral system that recognizes the outsized value rural areas generate for the rest of the country.
Political science professor turned Liberal MP Dr. Will Greaves agrees Canada's electoral system isn't proportional, but says that's to the benefit of rural communities and their advocates.
Actors who are maybe relatively minor within our system can still be veto players. That under the right circumstances, the mayor of Montreal or the mayor of Vancouver or the premier of one province or another, or as has been the case in Canadian history previously, even a single legislator in a single provincial legislature can have the power to fundamentally alter the course of the country's history.
Biologist and social scientist Dr. Victoria Lakazik says that her research on environmental policy suggests it's actually rural communities that have the most power in our electoral system.
Especially in Western Canada, our vote is really affected by the rural populations more so than the urban population.
Who's right? Well, in truth, they all are.
Rural communities have less of a say in provincial and national matters than those who live in urban centers because urbanites are the significantly larger demographic in Canada. They represent more than 80% of the Canadian population. Yet urbanites are significantly underrepresented in Canada's first-past-the-post electoral system. As Michael Pell of the University of Ottawa explained to CBC, quote, "Your vote in Labrador is probably worth 3.5 times more than a vote in Vancouver. So it's as if we said everybody in Labrador gets 3.5 ballots and everyone in Vancouver gets 1. And there are countless examples of urban ridings that have populations in the hundreds of thousands and rural ridings with populations in just the tens of thousands." Michael Pell added to the CBC, quote, "The least powerful voter in Canada is probably a recent immigrant from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, or China who lives in Brampton, Markham, or Mississauga, places where the population is growing very quickly. So that tends to be the suburbs around the biggest cities. It's not necessarily downtown Toronto, but it's the 905 area code, the suburbs around Toronto.
It's an imperfect system without a perfect alternative. Division of any kind, but especially the urban-rural divide, threatens to further complicate an incredibly difficult decision. And that's especially true when the goal is to balance majority will and minority rights of one segment of the population against the rights of other minority populations. And almost every decision impacts someone's bottom line, their culture, their beliefs, their livelihood, their sense of justice, our environment.
We've got to figure out how to come together more often. And I think in a way we do separate ourselves quite quickly and put ourselves into silos or into categories or groups. I'm right wing, I'm left wing, I'm conservative, I'm liberal, I like cheese, I don't like cheese.
Pete Smith is an artist as well as the founder of the Rural Center for Arts and Creativity. He argues that even if we do like to separate ourselves into silos, the urban-rural divide...
I think it's in the mind. I don't think it's necessarily something that is physical.
Which isn't to say Pete dismisses the idea of societal divisions.
There are a lot of folks who have points of view that are very, very strong, and they absolutely are not interested in any other point of view other than their own.
And that's the issue. For when we don't listen, we often make faulty assumptions, as demographic expert Hamish Marshall explains.
The divide's often not quite where you see it.
The real societal division, Hamish says,
I think it comes down to more of a divide around opportunity. That there's a lot of places in rural Canada that don't feel like there's an awful lot of opportunity. Whereas if you're in a large city, even if you're commuting in a long way, there might be an opportunity to work in interesting jobs that are for a variety of employers that don't exist in smaller communities. But there's a lot of places on sort of a spectrum in between. A lot of suburban places, some of increasing density, some that are pretty low density and pretty ex-urban, is where that opinion divide comes is interesting. At various points in the past, we've actually found that the suburban areas have attitudes much more similar to rural areas. And then when at other points in the last 10 years, suburban areas had a lot more similarities to the more densely urban areas.
Which is a different take on an important issue. And that matters. Because when we move beyond assumptions, new realities, new opportunities can emerge. It's why in a moment like this, Hamish urges us all to
reject easy categories. When you look at the numbers, is realizing that the world is anything but monolithic, that there's an incredible amount of different perspectives and different lives that everybody's living, and understanding that is good for all of us.
Pete Smith agrees that we must move beyond our assumed differences.
In the same way I feel about rural folk, I feel about urban folk, I feel about the trees, the water, and the stones. I think that we really have to start to broaden our definition of who we are, what we are, why we are. While I know there are divisions, I see the opportunity in people coming together. So it's these transferences. It's sitting down at a kitchen table. It's getting together and exploring differences together and have a conversation.
How do we accomplish this?
I'll go to story, the culture or the creativity that brings people together, and the creative part of your brain that gets lit up, not the part that's kind of starting to get isolated and get into a silo and you're wrong and I'm right, is story and in creativity. I believe that the cultural divide, whatever it might be anywhere, is being able to sit with another person and hear them tell a story. So I think the divide is actually crossed through listening, So when I sit at a kitchen table and listen to someone who stops judging me for what I am, what I look like, for who I am, where I come from, and everything else, and they start telling me a story, and in the story then comes your heart. And then when you're actually serving that up, the vulnerability and innocence comes back into play. And when that comes up, then I think you're in a position to really get into a meaningful conversation about what it is to be here.
And what does it mean to be here, to be Canadian? Well, maybe it starts with agreeing on these fundamental truths.
I think that you have something to eat. So the Chinese have a salutation. Have you had your bowl of rice today? If you haven't, then you must eat before anything else. So I think that somebody has a bite to eat is important. And I also think the ability to learn. And I think through that learning is an ongoing curiosity about the world and realizing that you know nothing. And that as you learn and continue to learn, you realize that there's so much more to learn. Then how do we, if we can get ourselves out of our own myopia, then how do we think about the little beings and then water and trees and actually handing the place, leave the campsite better than you found it was what my old man always said. Treat others the way you'd like to be treated. And those two tenets should be available all the time, regardless of disagreement.
Pete's right. Before we can settle on a road forward for our nation, we first must reach a common understanding of our equally valid realities and challenges. We must listen to what makes us different so we can work together towards a Canada that unites.
I think that needs to be a part of our education process. I think that there's a cultural divide there. I think too often some students are learning one thing and others are learning another. And I think, again, we're tending to put people into these silos of thinking. But it's also, if you can get to a place where just because it's different, it doesn't make it weird. And I think too often we go, oh, that's just weird. Like, oh, I can't imagine that. I go, no. It's not weird. It's just different. And that lesson has been taught to me. There's a French writer named Jean-Marc Delpay. And one day I was talking to him about how every year the group in France get together and decide which is feminine, which is masculine, the new words that are coming into the French language. And I said, isn't that weird? And he said, no, Peter, it is not weird. It is just a difference. And I think in some ways the cultural divide will be crossed when we stop looking at things as a threat to us and an opportunity to come together is there. Now, I say all this stuff and it's idealistic, but if we don't have a dream, if we don't have a vision for what the future is beyond just fighting, then we'll just continue to fight. And I don't live that way. I don't, and I'm not interested in living that way.